superheroes wear capes. I want to tell you about one of my heroes. He probably doesn't know that he's one of my heroes, but my secret's going to be out now. This man's name is Andrew Murray. And I think he's going to be furious at me for calling him a hero. I came to know Andrew Murray when he was a senator for the Australian Democrats in the early 2000s. But he had a long story before that. He was born in England, but travelled to Rhodesia, now Zimbabwe, as a child migrant after the Second World War. He was educated in South Africa before winning a Rhodes Scholarship to Oxford University. In 1968, while he was at university in South Africa, he was deported because, as the leader of a white student group, he stood up to the South African government in opposition to the racist apartheid policy, which treated black and mixed race South Africans as second and third class human beings. He ran businesses, he served in the military, he came to Australia, and he was elected as a senator for Western Australia. Now, all that's impressive enough. But in the Senate, Andrew Murray turned out to be one of the most remarkable legislators Australia has ever seen. He was part of a tiny party, although they did often hold crucial numbers in the chamber. But he was a fantastic negotiator, and he won respect from people in all parties because he didn't play politics. He had a fantastic eye for legal detail, and when he spoke, it was with conviction and principle. When I knew him, though, he did his best work in the back rooms in private meetings that most people don't get to find out about. He would convince government members to change their own legislation privately before it was even put to the vote. He worked tirelessly on committees, and very often the Senate passed his amendments without any idea that they had originally been his. He didn't care about publicity or kudos. He just wanted to get things done. Andrew Murray left the Senate in 2008, and in 2013 he was appointed as one of the Royal Commissioners into institutional responses to child sexual abuse. In the Parliament, when they change the laws, they can do powerful good or dreadful, dreadful evil. Andrew Murray was a force for good. What was the process, though? How does a good idea, or a bad one for that matter, become a law? That's what we'll learn in this module. G'day everyone, Anthony Merrick is my name, and this is the second video in the second module of our Introduction to Law. In this video, we're going to dig right down deep into the parliamentary process and look at how legislation is made. Because if you're going to have a strong understanding of the law, you're going to need to understand how the law is made, not just which books you can find it in. So let's start at the very beginning. The first question we need to ask is, well, where does the idea for a new law come from? I mean, this is a question that people often forget. Someone at the start of the process has to say, you know what? We need a new law about this. Well, who does that? And how? There are a few different ways it happens. One obvious one is that each political party goes to each election with a range of promises. Some of those will be more important, some of them will be less important. But the big ones, the key promises, they will often require new legislation. And so if that political party wins, it's reasonable that they will then begin to pass the necessary legislation to implement their promises. That's one way that legislation begins. But there are other ways too. For instance, sometimes groups of citizens or industry groups might come forward and seek changes to the laws which affect them. There's a whole industry of lobby groups out there whose purpose is to promote changes to the law. So let's say there was a particular provision in the banking laws which was making it difficult for banks to operate. Well, the Australian Banking Association might start speaking to politicians about the need to change that law. If they were convincing, then the law would be changed. Another way is via the courts. You see, sometimes the courts interpret a piece of legislation in a way that the Parliament never intended. Now, the Parliament can't just override the court decision. Remember the separation of powers that we talked about in the first video of this module. But the Parliament can go back and clarify that section so that the court interprets it differently the next time. Then we have bodies called law reform commissions. Now, these are pretty cool if you're a legal nerd like me. The law reform commissions act independently of the government. They choose pieces of legislation, one at a time, sometimes more than one at a time, and they go through that piece of legislation and review it. They ask questions like, how's it working in practice? Are there ways in which it could be improved? They often invite submissions from experts or members of the public who can have their say too. I don't know about you, but I'm glad that somebody out there is taking a look at all these old laws, checking in with them, making sure that they're okay. Now, sometimes Australia signs international agreements, or Australia might be taken to an international court, which makes it clear that our current laws don't meet our international obligations. The interesting thing is that those international bodies can't actually force the Australian government to change Australian law. However, we as a country generally try to do the right thing. So that's another way in which laws might be changed. The point is that somebody, whether a law reform commission or a court or a politician or a lobby group or an international lawyer, has identified a law which needs changing. And they've persuaded the government, that is, the ministers in Parliament, to change the law. Now, there is another way that laws are initiated, and that's what we call private members' bills or private senators' bills. You see, any member of Parliament can bring a bill forward. However, those private bills, which are not brought forward by the government, are very rarely successful. It's got to be said. So what happens then? Well, before anything goes any further, the political process is going to get involved. Because when you cut away all the nasty name calling and bad behaviour, politics is really about deciding what decisions should be made on behalf of our society and what issues are going to be priorities. There are a few political realities which are going to come into play here. First, oftentimes a legislative change is going to have winners and losers. If money is spent on one priority, it won't be spent on another. If banks are allowed to introduce a new charge, consumers suffer. If employees get a new entitlement, employers suffer. If the coal industry gets a new subsidy, the solar industry suffers. The political process involves thinking about these winners and losers. The governing political party will really have two key thoughts in mind. First, they want their own supporters to be the winners as often as possible. So the Liberal Party is often associated with business. The Nationals are often associated with farmers. The Greens are often associated with environmentalists. The Labor Party are often associated with working people and the unions. It's reasonable that each party will seek to make their supporters the winners. Second, they want to win the next election. So they want to make winners out of the voters who will be most important in the next election. Those are the voters in what we call marginal seats, where the sitting member is only hanging on by a small number of votes. If the government holds that seat, then they want to support that member so that next time they win by more votes. If the government doesn't hold that seat, then they want to try and make sure that that local area, those local communities, feel like they've been getting attention and support so that they're more likely to vote for the government next time. The other political factor comes from the media, and nowadays also from social media. How is this new legislation going to play out in the media and on Facebook? Will anyone care? Obviously, the best sort of legislation from the government's perspective is legislation that generates a positive buzz in the media and online. Next best is legislation that doesn't even make it on the radar. The worst is legislation that causes media outcry and results in adverse hashtags and gives the impression that the government is incompetent or in crisis. The sad reality is that very good legislation might never be passed if the media buzz is going to be adverse, or if the winners from the legislation are not the supporters of the government. The politics isn't always pretty, but it does always matter. When you, as a new lawyer, are reading legislation, remember that it wasn't just made by disinterested, impartial academics. It was made by politicians who were trying to choose what they felt would be the right winners and who were trying to win the next election. That context is really important. Okay, so now we have a proposal supported by one minister. Remember in the last video, we talked about cabinet and the ideas of individual and collective cabinet responsibility? Well, it's hardly fair for all the ministers to be collectively responsible for legislation if they've never had a chance to discuss that legislation. So any lawmaking proposal of any significance will need to be discussed in the cabinet. This is particularly important because most of the time, a new proposal is not only going to affect one area of law. For instance, consider a proposal to build a new coal mine in central Queensland. That's the sort of proposal that we might expect to be brought forward by the minister responsible for mines and energy. But it's also likely to be very relevant to the minister responsible for agriculture, especially if the mine site is going to be on or near farmland. It's likely to affect the minister for transport if new roads or railways will be required. It's likely to affect the Minister for Employment because jobs will be generated. It's likely to affect the Minister responsible for social welfare issues if the outcome will affect the price of electricity. It's likely to affect the Minister responsible for Aboriginal issues if the mine or the new transport infrastructure are near sites of cultural significance. And it's likely to affect the Tourism Minister and the Environment Minister if there's going to be any impact on the Great Barrier Reef. So before the Cabinet meeting happens, the Minister who intends to propose new legislation will consult with their colleagues and with their colleagues' public service departments to seek support. The proposal might well change as a result of the views of those other ministers. And indeed, it might well be defeated before it gets anywhere near the Parliament. Let's assume that it's not defeated though. The next step will be for the department proposing the bill to write some drafting instructions and provide them to the Office of Parliamentary Counsel. The Office of Parliamentary Counsel is composed of specialist lawyers whose job is to painstakingly and carefully write legislation. So the instructions to them will tell them what the legislation is supposed to achieve, and then they will write the actual words of the bill, intending to achieve whatever is in the drafting instructions. Often the legislation will bounce backwards and forwards between the department and the Office of Parliamentary Counsel, and they'll work together to try to make sure the bill that emerges at the end of the day accomplishes the intended purpose, but also that it doesn't inadvertently affect other pieces of legislation. And they'll also work together to make sure that the language used in the bill is consistent with the language used everywhere else in the law. This is a slow and detailed process, but it kind of has to be, because if the legislation is even just a little bit wrong, actual people and actual businesses and actual communities and actual ecosystems may suffer. Now, no matter how meticulous the Office of Parliamentary Counsel might be, and no matter how careful the department might be, there's still always the possibility of mistakes being made. One step that can be taken to safeguard against these is the release of what's called an exposure draft of the bill. Exposure drafts aren't mandatory, so you certainly don't see them for every piece of legislation. But they're a good idea, especially for more complicated or more controversial bills. With an exposure draft, the government places a copy of the bill on its website and invites comments from anybody, from the industry, from the public, from academics, from anyone. Now, some of the comments, of course, will just be political. People will say, we don't think this bill should go ahead at all. But that's not really the idea of the exposure draft. The government has pretty much decided to go ahead with the bill. Some comments on the exposure draft, though, will be more helpful and more detailed. They might say, the licensing requirements in Chapter 3 of the bill seem quite onerous and expensive. We suggest a slightly different process for obtaining a licence. Or they might say, Section 17 seems to directly conflict with a specific piece of Queensland legislation, and that's going to create real problems for people operating in Queensland. The department, along with the Office of Parliamentary Counsel, will consider all of those exposure draft comments and decide whether to make any changes to the bill. Now, the beautiful thing here is that if any changes are made, everyone knows that they're just changes to an exposure draft. This isn't seen as the government flip-flopping or backing down or anything political like that. It's a good, safe way for governments to seek the involvement of experts and the community in the legislative process. If there's an area of law that you're particularly interested in, keep an eye on the relevant department's website, because there's no reason at all why you can't make a contribution to the exposure draft process. So now, after all this, we're getting close to actually bringing our bill into Parliament. We're not quite there yet, but we're getting close. The next decision will be whether the bill is controversial or non-controversial. Both the House of Representatives and the Senate have processes in place to move non-controversial legislation through the legislative process quickly, with a minimum of debate and a minimum of delay. Non-controversial legislation tends to come in two types. First, there's what we call machinery legislation. This is really technical legislation, which might be required, for instance, to extend the dates on a government program or to change a clear typographical error or something as minor as that. Parliament only has so much time, and there's just no point having a full-blown debate about stuff like that. The second type of non-controversial legislation is legislation that is totally agreed between the parties. An example was the Crimes Amendment Bill 2002. You see, on the 12th of October 2002, terrorists exploded a bomb in Kuta on the island of Bali, resulting in the deaths of 202 people, including 88 Australians. Once the wounded had been returned and the bodies recovered, there was a sudden and urgent need for the Australian Federal Police to be able to access national, state and territory DNA databases in order to help them identify victims who could not otherwise be identified. There was an urgent need, and time was critical. Well, the bill allowing that database access was introduced into the House of Representatives on the 22nd of October, passed the House the same day, passed the Senate the following day, and received royal assent on the same day it passed. Everyone knew it was the right thing to do. There was no controversy at all. And so that bill flew through Parliament. Of course, many bills are not nearly so lucky. The nature of Parliament is often about conflict. The different political parties have different supporter bases with different values. Members and senators come from different communities which have different priorities and different interests. As a nation, we allow those interests to collide and fight it out in the Parliament because that's a whole lot less messy and a whole lot more civilised than doing it on the battlefield. However, as I mentioned a few moments ago, the Parliament only has so much time. Politicians also need to spend time working in committees, actually reading proposed legislation, thinking about it and preparing for debates. They need to spend time in their home communities, meeting with constituents and meeting with community groups. People seem to want politicians to be in Parliament every day working on the laws, but they also want politicians to be available for them when they need help. You kind of can't have it both ways. So even once a bill is ready to go into the Parliament, it's going to have to find a place on the schedule. The schedule is usually arranged by particular members of Parliament called the Manager of Government Business and the Manager of Opposition Business. There's one each for the House of Representatives and there's one each for the Senate. And they work together pretty closely to put the bills in an order which reflects the government's priorities, but which also makes the best possible use of the Parliament's time. This means that some bills will go straight into the chamber for debate, but other bills might sit around for many months waiting their turn. And unfortunately, any bill which is still waiting when the following election is called, well, that bill lapses and it's gone before it even begins, waiting and hoping that the new government will pick it up again. So now let's follow our bill actually into Parliament. The big day has arrived and the bill is ready to be introduced. To get through each House of Parliament, a bill passes through 3 stages, which are called readings. I can explain why, but it means hitting you with just a little bit more history. You see, back in the day, when literacy was not all that widespread and when the printing press was new and printing was incredibly expensive, a proposed new law would be read out in the House of Commons, the entire thing. And then debate could proceed because everyone had heard the bill being read out. Well, nowadays, obviously, some pieces of modern legislation run to hundreds of pages. Literacy is universal among our parliamentarians and printing materials off is inexpensive. It'd be a profound waste of time to read out the whole bill. Instead, the minister moves that the bill be read a first time and the clerk in each chamber merely reads out what we call the long title of the bill. Now, there's virtually never any debate on the first reading of the legislation, and that makes sense because the purpose of that first reading is really only to place the bill before the Parliament. Symbolically, the first reading says, here is a bill, which I, as the Minister, am placing on the table for Parliament. Can all other members please consider this bill so that we can debate it and hopefully pass it? The first reading speech really only takes a few seconds, but once it has happened, the bill is officially parliamentary business. The next stage is called, strangely enough, the second reading. The second reading stage, though, is a bit different. You see, the purpose of the second reading stage is to debate the policy of the bill. So, without digging into the actual words, The second reading considers the more general question: do we need this bill at all? Is there actually a problem worth fixing? And if there is a problem worth fixing, well, is this the way to fix it? Normally, when the minister moves the second reading, the minister will then make what's called a second reading speech, or in some jurisdictions, an introductory speech. Now, as you'll learn in the next video, the second reading speech is rather important because it sets out the government's reasons for bringing forward the bill. It tells us what the bill is supposed to accomplish and how the bill is supposed to bring that about. This can be really important when we're trying to read and understand the final legislation. In the parliamentary debate, the minister's second reading speech kicks off the debate. Normally what happens is that once the minister has made their second reading speech, the debate is adjourned to another day so that all other members of parliament can go away and read the bill and prepare to debate it. At the same time, the minister tables what's called the explanatory memorandum. Now, we'll talk more about this particular document in the next video as well, but in brief, the explanatory memorandum is a plain English version of the bill, which includes a piece-by-piece explanation of what each section is meant to do, as well as some more general explanations of the policy behind the legislation. When the bill comes back before the Parliament, the second reading debate continues. Now, this might be weeks later, it might be months later. The second reading debate continues. Usually, everyone who wants to speak gets the opportunity to do so, although sometimes those debates are guillotined or cut short. But the idea is that everyone who wants to speak about a bill should get a chance to do so. And then at the end of the debate, the minister replies to those speeches and sums up the debate. The chamber then votes on the second reading, and if it is passed, the clerk reads out the long title again. So at that point, the bill has had its second reading. Now, while all of this is going on, there's often another parliamentary process underway. You see, the Senate has a series of committees called the Senate Legislation Committees. So there's an Economics Legislation Committee, an Environment and Communications Legislation Committee, a Foreign Affairs, Defence and Trade Legislation Committee, and so on. Once a bill has received its first reading in either house, the bill can be referred to one of these committees for review. Those reviews can take some time, so it makes sense to get them started while the bill is in its earliest stages. That way the committee report can be done before the bill comes up for debate in the Senate. These committees are extremely hard-working. Hardly anyone hears about them, but they work really hard. They invite public submissions, but then they also hold public hearings where people, including experts who have a lot of knowledge about a bill or who are going to be particularly affected by the bill, will be able to make statements and answer questions. Now, in some ways, this is slightly similar to the exposure draft process that we talked about just before, but it includes senators from all the political parties. The reports from these committees are often surprisingly influential, and the committee meetings provide the senators with an opportunity to cooperate across party lines in private, to really work together to improve legislation without worrying about the inevitable theatre which occurs in the Parliament itself. Earlier in my career, I had the privilege of working for several Senate committees, and in my view, they really are the engine room of our parliamentary democracy. They just quietly go about making the law better. This was the area of parliamentary work that Senator Andrew Murray truly excelled in. All right, so now let's get back to the main legislative process. After the second reading, you'd expect the third reading to be next, right? Wrong. The next stage is called the consideration in detail stage, or in the Senate, it's called the committee of the whole stage. This is the part of the process where the Parliament really digs down into the individual clauses of the bill. Members and senators have the opportunity to suggest amendments to each clause. Now, Some bills contain many thousands of clauses, and obviously it's not realistic for each of those to be debated. So the way it works is that senators and members nominate which clauses they want to amend or challenge, and only those clauses end up getting debated. So the whole bill is available for debate, but sometimes it really might only be a handful of clauses that are actually controversial. So those will be the ones that get discussed. Consideration in detail in the House of Representatives tends to be very brief because the government has a majority. Remember, that's how you get to be Prime Minister of form of government in the first place. So opposition amendments tend to be voted down very quickly. The consideration in detail stage in the Senate, which is called the Committee of the Whole, sometimes takes a lot more time because the government rarely holds a majority in the Senate, and so it's not uncommon for the minor parties to combine with the opposition in order to change the detailed content of a bill, or indeed in order to defeat a bill altogether. Once all of those controversial clauses have been debated, the amended bill, if it has been amended, proceeds to its third reading. The third reading of the bill is really just a formality. By this stage, the Chamber has debated the policy behind the bill and passed it, and they've debated the details of the bill and passed it either with or without amendments. So the third reading is moved by the Minister, the clerk reads out the long title a third time, and then the clerk can certify the bill as having been passed by that House. Well, at this point, the bill's only halfway there. Now the bill has to be transmitted to the other House, and there's a beautiful bit of theatre as that happens. If the bill starts in the House of Representatives, then the Sergeant-at-Arms, dressed in tails and a white bow tie, walks the bill across Members' Hall and stands in the back of the Senate chamber, where the Deputy Clerk will meet him or her and accept the bill. If the bill starts in the Senate, then the usher of the black rod, carrying the ceremonial black rod, takes the bill into the House of Representatives. These traditions go back centuries, and to be honest, there's no real need for them anymore, but I think those traditions still count for something. And there's nothing wrong with a little bit of pomp and circumstance. Once the bill has been transmitted, then the manager of government business in that House, in the second House, puts it on the schedule, and we go through the whole process again. Except, of course, that the relevant Senate Legislation Committee doesn't need to do its thing all over again. As I've already mentioned, for a bill to be finally passed as an act, as a law, it has to be agreed by both houses in identical form. And that means identical, right down to the last comma and the last full stop. So what happens then? If a bill starts in the House of Reps, it's transmitted to the Senate, and then in the Committee of the Whole, the Senate changes something. Well, in that case, the bill which the Senate agrees to in its third reading stage is not going to be identical to the bill that passed through the House of Representatives. Well, in that case, the bill is returned to the House of Representatives for the House to consider those proposed amendments. If the House accepts those amendments, well, then the bill has been agreed to by both houses and it's good to go. If the House doesn't agree with those amendments, well, then 3 months later, it can just undo them and send the bill back to the Senate. And then the Senate can make those amendments all over again. What happens then? What happens in this deadlock situation? Well, in most cases, the practical reality is that the government just drops the bill. It's been defeated. However, sometimes the bill becomes what's called a double dissolution trigger. This means that the Prime Minister can, if they want to, they can go to the Governor-General and say, the Parliament will not pass this legislation. And it's really important that this legislation be passed. So in order to get the legislation passed, I would like a new election. This would be a special election though, because the whole House of Representatives and the whole Senate, not just half the Senate, would be up for election. You see, the Prime Minister would be hoping that the new Parliament would be more supportive and would pass the legislation. If they don't, not even after the election, well then the last ditch solution is to hold what's called a joint sitting of both houses, where the houses vote as one, so all 226 members voting at the same time. This has only happened once, in 1974. Let's assume, though, that the legislation is passed by both houses in identical form. What happens then? The final stage of the process is that the bill, certified by both clerks as having been passed, is taken to the Governor-General, who, acting with the authority of the Queen, gives the bill royal assent. On that day, the bill becomes an act and it's part of our law. Now, there's one last thing to briefly mention. For the sake of clarity, I've spoken in this video about the Commonwealth Parliament. The state and territory parliaments follow very similar patterns, although if you're in Queensland, the Northern Territory, or the Australian Capital Territory, then you only need to worry about one House of Parliament. So, now we know a bit about parliaments, and we know a bit about how they pass legislation. The next video in this module looks at how we, as law students and lawyers, can research and read those acts. This is a crucial skill for the rest of your time in the law and a fantastic skill to learn early. See you soon.